Hi, I'm Carlton Allen, pastor at First Baptist Church in Commerce, Georgia, and we are doing a midweek Bible study. It's been a few weeks since we've done one of these. Part of that was due to the fact that I was out sick, but we're continuing a series we began on love stories from the Old Testament. We're looking at couples in the Old Testament and how their experience can teach us something about faith and maybe even something about how we relate to one another today. This study is based on 1 Samuel chapter 1, and we're looking at the story of Elkanah and Hannah. I want to encourage you to get your Bible, have it with you. If you need to pause the video in order to go do that, then do that. At a couple of places, I'm going to have you read some verses, and again, when that time comes, you can pause the video and read the verses, and then there's some questions I'll be asking about those verses afterward. So, 1 Samuel chapter 1, the story of Elkanah and Hannah. One of the things that's important to note is the setting here. 1 Samuel was a time of the judges in Israel's history. In other words, there was no king. Israel was not ruled by a monarch. They were ruled or led by a series of judges, sort of like tribal chieftains, I guess. There's no temple at this time. Instead, the tabernacle, the tent of worship, is set up at Shiloh. And this will be an important part of the story to understand that when Elkanah and Hannah go to Shiloh and go to sacrifice, they're doing so in the tabernacle because the temple has not yet been built. Take a moment now and read verses 1 through 11 of 1 Samuel chapter 1. 1 Samuel chapter 1, verses 1 through 11. What characteristics about the relationship between Elkanah and Hannah stand out to you? One of the things that I note was there's a great depth of love here. Elkanah, we're told, while he has two wives, he offers a double portion for his wife, Hannah. She has not been able to bear him children, and that was a very important part of a relationship between a husband and wife in that day, and yet Elkanah still loves her. But this condition has been a source of disappointment for Hannah. So she's dealing with some pretty powerful emotions here. Why do you think Elkanah had two wives? Obviously, we see other places in the Old Testament where men had more than one wife, or they had concubines or servants with whom they had sexual relations. The reason for that was because of the importance that was placed on an heir, on children, and particularly a male heir who could carry on the family name and who therefore would be able to provide for the family after the father had died. So it's likely that Elkanah has two wives because Hannah has not been able to bear children. In fact, Hannah herself may have urged Elkanah to take another woman as his wife so that she could produce children. Now, consider Elkanah's words in verse 8. Her husband Elkanah said to her, "Hannah, why do you weep? Why do you not eat? Why is your heart sad? Am I not more to you than 10 sons?" If you were Hannah, do you think these words would comfort you? I'm guessing they wouldn't. Elkanah means well. He's trying to be encouraging to his wife, but that really doesn't register with her. The pain she feels, the disappointment she feels, perhaps even some amount of shame, is not going to be overcome by words like that, though Elkanah means well. Chapter 1 of 1 Samuel begins with the mention of a certain man named Elkanah. Now, actually, this chapter is about his wife, Hannah. She's the main character in this chapter. Her name means grace, but that's kind of ironic. Grace didn't exactly characterize her life at this point. She was one of two wives of Elkanah. The other wife was named Peninnah. Elkanah loved Hannah, but she had not borne him children, and that was extremely important in this culture. It was important to have a child, and particularly a male child, that could be your heir, carry on your name, and could help with the work that was done to support the family, and should the father die, then the son could support the rest of the family. Now, since Hannah was not able to bear children, Elkanah could have divorced her according to the custom of the times, because a male heir was simply that important. It's interesting, there was no consideration in that day that the male might be the one who was infertile, or who was not able to produce a child. Also, there was no knowledge at that time that the father's genetic contribution determined the child's gender. This was a patriarchal society, and so things were very much set up to favor the men. Rabbis have suggested that Hannah herself urged Elkanah to take another wife because she knew the importance of having a child and a male heir, and since she could not produce that for her husband, she urged him to take another wife, which was something that was considered appropriate in that time. The name Peninnah means luxuriant hair, or perhaps ruby, or perhaps pearl. It also could mean prolific. All of those kind of rub salt in Hannah's wound. Here's a woman who cannot bear children, and her husband's second wife has a name that means prolific. That just stabbed her in the heart over and over. Peninnah is able to bear children, including sons. But Hannah was still the love of Elkanah's life. And so when he would go to offer sacrifices at Shiloh, at the tabernacle, he would offer a double portion for his wife Hannah. Now, Peninnah has her own issues to deal with, apparently. She responds to this by needling Hannah constantly. She's aware that her husband is offering a double portion of sacrifice for his wife Hannah. By all rights, he should have been offering a double portion for his oldest son, which would have been one of Peninnah's children. He offers a double portion for Hannah. Oh, if only Dr. Phil had been around to straighten out this family, right? And it's important to note that Peninnah was not a surrogate, as was Hagar in the situation with Abraham. Hagar was a servant. Peninnah wasn't a servant and a surrogate in that way. She was a legal wife for Elkanah. The fall festival was always celebrated at Shiloh, where the tabernacle was located. It's supposed to be a time for great joy, but it wasn't for Hannah. An animal was sacrificed during that time. The blood and the visceral fat and the tail of the animal, usually a bull, was offered on the altar. A forequarter of the animal was given to the priest. That was how the priest had food to eat. And the family kept the rest. But they had to eat the rest over the next 2 days. In other words, they couldn't keep the meat longer than that. And this is what Elkanah divides. Again, Peninnah's eldest son should have received a double portion, not Hannah, but Hannah instead receives a double portion of meat that's kept for the family to eat. This favoritism on the part of Elkanah only incites Peninnah. Hannah couldn't even eat what she was given. That's what it means in verse 7, where it says she wept and would not eat. She could not even eat this double portion that she was given. And that's where Elkanah, in his awkward way and in a really not very effective way, tries to comfort her by saying, "Do I not mean more to you than 10 sons?" That's not going to cut it. That's not going to make Hannah feel better. And so she's disappointed and she's miserable. So she turns to God. It's interesting to note that Hannah does not blame God for her condition. Instead, she pours out her heart to him. She lets him know how she is feeling without placing blame on God. And then she makes a sacred vow. She says that if God will allow her to bear a son, she will promise to give that gift back to God. In other words, if you'll allow me to have a son, I promise that I will dedicate that child to your service. There's a reference there to no razor shall touch his head, and that's led many to believe that this is a Nazirite vow. In fact, some translations of Scripture have that, but the word that is translated as Nazirite literally means separated or consecrated. So this may be a vow other than a Nazirite vow. But the important thing to understand is that Hannah makes a vow to dedicate to the Lord any child that she is given. Now, take a moment and read 1 Samuel chapter 1, verses 12 through 20. Chapter 1, verses 12 through 20. How would you describe Hannah in these verses? What kind of person does she appear to be? I think, first of all, you would have to consider her a very faithful person. She's a person that does not want to draw attention to herself when she prays. She prays silently. She does not make a show of things. She does not ensure that other people can hear what she's saying to God. Of course, that leads the priest Eli to misinterpret what's going on here. And even though he questions and kind of insults Hannah with his question, assuming that maybe she is drunk, Hannah does not respond in anger. She says, "No, my Lord, I'm a woman deeply troubled. I've neither drunken wine nor strong drink, but I've been pouring out my soul before the Lord." So Hannah is a very gentle person. She's a very forgiving person. She is a very faithful person, and she's not one to make a show of things. How does Hannah interpret Eli's blessing in verse 17? You'll note in verse 17, Eli says, "Then Eli answered, 'Go in peace. The God of Israel grant the petition you have made to him.'" Now, we're going to talk about that. There's a translation issue here that makes this interesting. Hannah obviously considers this to be a blessing. That means that she will receive what she has asked of God. Now, When Eli sees Hannah praying silently with her lips moving, he assumes that she's drunk. It may be that Eli was hard of hearing, or maybe he's just insensitive here. Either way, what he says to her is rude. How long will you make a drunken spectacle of yourself? Put away your wine. Eli is assuming something, and he has no knowledge of that, and so he's very rude to Hannah. But Hannah refuses to be deterred by the rudeness of the priest. She also refuses to be labeled, as the priest has tried to do. She sets the record straight, but she does so in a very gentle and respectful way. Notice the nuance of Eli's response in verse 17. He doesn't say, this is a word from the Lord. And he doesn't say, God has told me that he will grant you what you've asked of him. We're told in these days that a word from the Lord was rare. So this is really not a pronouncement of God's blessing. It's more like a wish for a blessing. The way the verb is used is key here. The verb that's used there can be may God grant the petition, or it could be God will grant the petition. It seems that what Eli is saying is may God grant the petition. In other words, I hope God gives you what you are asking of him. He has been chastened by the response that Hannah gave to his rude assumption, and so he has hopes that God will grant the blessing that she is asking for. Hannah, on the other hand, interprets this as God will grant the petition. She understands this to mean that God has declared that he will give her what she has asked of him. Regardless of intent and interpretation, this gives Hannah hope. She goes home and she eats. She's no longer sad. All of this is based on her belief that God is going to grant her petition. There's a sense of trust within Hannah that God is going to respond to her request and that he is going to grant her request. For someone who's gone through a depressive episode, this kind of encouragement can make all the difference in the world. And it may be that one of the things that happens here is that because her depression has been lifted, she's more responsive to Elkanah's desires. So maybe that's part of what's going on here. We're told that the Lord remembered the one who had in verse 11 described herself as a forgotten servant. This was Hannah's view of herself earlier, that she was a forgotten servant because she had never borne children. And it says here that God remembered her. That's important. It's interesting, when the child is born, Hannah names him. It says, in due time Hannah conceived and bore a son. She named him Samuel, for she said, I've asked him of the Lord. Now, normally the naming of a child is the responsibility of the father. But here Hannah takes that responsibility, and Elkanah doesn't seem to argue this with her. He seems to accept that this is appropriate, maybe even that this is necessary for Hannah to be the one who gives the child a name. And of course the name is very significant and very special. It's Samuel, for she says, I have asked him of the Lord. In other words, she is acknowledging in naming this child that God has heard her petition, has heard her prayer, and has granted it. Now, take a moment and read chapter 1, verses 21 through 28. 21 through 28. All right? How did Elkanah and Hannah honor God after Samuel's birth? Well, they followed through on the promise that Hannah had made. They take the child to Eli the priest at the tabernacle, and they give him over to the priest to be raised as a servant of the Lord. How does Hannah fulfill the vow she made to God? She does exactly what she had promised to do. She takes the child to the priest and she leaves him there. Can you imagine what kind of courage and faith and fortitude it must have taken for Hannah to give up this child she so desperately desired to be raised by the priest? We're told that Hannah, after she returns home from the tabernacle, conceived immediately. Samuel probably would have been less than 3 months old at the time of the next fall festival. It was at the fall festival where Hannah was praying and asking a gift from God, where the priest gave her that blessing and where she was encouraged. So she comes home, she immediately gives birth to Samuel, and so less than 3 months later there's another fall festival. It's rolled around. Verse 21 suggests that Elkanah made vows of his own, and he was faithful to pay them. The man Elkanah and all his household went up to offer to the Lord the yearly sacrifice and to pay his vow. Is it possible that Elkanah had also been asking God for a child by his wife Hannah? Did he make some kind of promise to God about this? Now, at that time of that next fall festival, we said Samuel probably was only 3 months old. So he was too old to be taken away from his mother. He had not yet been weaned. And so at this next fall festival, Hannah stays home with the child. She does not want to take him to the tabernacle until she can leave him there. In those days, babies were breastfed until they were probably 2 or 3 years old. Obviously, Hannah could have found a wet nurse, but who could blame her for wanting what time she could have with this child? So she intends to pay her vow, but she holds on to the child possibly for 3 years as she nurses him and as she comes to know this child and allow the child to come to know her. Verse 22b, though, she says, I will bring him. As soon as the child is weaned, I will bring him that he may appear in the presence of the Lord and remain there forever. I will offer him as a Nazirite, and actually that word literally means one separated or consecrated for all time. Now, it's interesting that the phrase, I will give him as a Nazirite for life, appears in one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were found several years ago in Israel. But it doesn't appear in other early texts from 1 Samuel. So it may well be that Nazirite, that term is not used in some of the manuscripts. Instead, it's consecrated or set aside. Elkanah trusts his wife and adds his approval of her vow. Now remember, we've said that it's possible that Elkanah had made a similar vow himself. There's a little suspense built with verses 21 through 23. Will Hannah follow through with her vow? It's one thing to promise this before the child is born, but she's probably spent about 3 years nursing this child, caring for this child. Is she going to be able to give the child up? Now, it's interesting, verses 24 through 28 seem to suggest that Hannah doesn't wait for the next festival to roll around when Samuel turns 3. She takes him as soon as he is weaned. Again, she could well have waited, but she wants to make sure that she is faithful to the vow that she's made to God, so she takes Samuel to the tabernacle as soon as he is weaned. Elkanah accompanies her. He is showing his support for what she is doing and for the vow she has made. They take a bull as a sacrifice. Now, one of the things we need to realize, a 3-year-old bull was a full-grown animal. That was an incredibly valuable animal for these people. This was not just some kind of, oh, I can afford to do this. This cost them something to offer this bull. And it's interesting that the bull is 3 years old. That may well have corresponded to Samuel's age, and maybe one of the reasons why that bull was selected. Hannah explains her actions to Eli. And the priest may well have been bewildered by the whole episode. His encounter with Hannah in the tabernacle had occurred 3 years earlier. He may not have remembered much about it. He may well have been stunned by this. Think what a bittersweet time this must have been for Hannah and for Elkanah. It's interesting, we're told that we're given the impression, at least, that Samuel doesn't run after her. Instead, he worships in the tabernacle, and according to some ancient manuscripts, he doesn't run after his mother and father. What a difficult thing for them to do. And yet, they had been faithful to the God who had been faithful to them. These were faithful parents. This is a story of faithful parents. This is a story of a faithful God. And as you read through the rest of the book of Samuel, 1 Samuel, you'll see that this is a faithful child as well. It's interesting. This is a time of great difficulty and disappointment, particularly for Hannah, but also, no doubt, for Elkanah. What are some things husbands and wives can do to help one another through times of difficulty? What are some of the things you see in this passage? One thing, there's a sense of sensitivity. Now, at one point, perhaps Elkanah was not very sensitive when he says to Hannah, "Am I not worth more than 10 sons?" But notice how he had made it a practice to offer a double portion for Hannah when he sacrificed at the tabernacle. He made Hannah feel special. He let her know how much she meant to him, regardless of whether she could bear children for him or not. So he was sensitive. It's also interesting to me, it seems like this is a couple that's very much in this together. Again, Elkanah may have made vows of his own. He follows Hannah's lead, allows Hannah to fulfill her vow to God. They are very much in this together. When a person is going through a difficult time and they're part of a relationship, if the person who is the other part of that relationship cannot share that difficulty in some way, then it leaves them feeling very much alone. You may not be able to help your spouse pull out of a time of depression or difficulty, but you can walk through that time with your spouse, and that can make a tremendous difference. Obviously, Elkanah is very compassionate toward Hannah. As I mentioned, he went along with her wishes. I think one of the great lines in here is where Elkanah says, "Do what seems best to you." He too had been living with his child for 3 years. This was a son given to him by the woman he most loved. And yet he is willing to give that child up if this is what his wife needs to do. I think that's an incredible point to make. He is willing to make sacrifices in order to allow his spouse to do what she feels she needs to do. I know of husbands and wives where the husband has given up his career, either retired or simply given it up to stay at home so that his wife could pursue her career. What a compassionate thing to do. Why does it take an extra measure of faith to trust God in times like this? Well, one of the things Hannah was dealing with was the expectations of her culture and society. Women were supposed to be able to bear children. Women were supposed to be able to bear male children so that their husbands would have someone to carry on the family name. So the society and culture sometimes places pressures on us that make what we're going through even more difficult. It was difficult for Hannah because of Peninnah. We can understand how Peninnah may have felt. Obviously, her husband was showing favoritism toward his wife Hannah, and so we understand Peninnah being upset about that perhaps, but she needles Hannah. She rubs it in. Sometimes when we go through difficulty, we have people who rub it in. They may not realize they're doing that, but they do. I think of couples today who are not able to have children, and maybe even their own family, not meaning to, but will rub it in by asking, when are you going to have a family? When are you going to start a family? Putting pressure on them in that way. Sometimes it takes an extra measure of faith to trust God because those around us and those closest to us may not be as sensitive as Elkanah was to Hannah. There are many reasons why it may take an extra measure of faith to trust God in such times. Finally, and I won't, I'll kind of leave you with this, and this is something you can consider over the next several days perhaps. What disappointments do you need to bring to God as Hannah did? What is it in your life that has been a disappointment? What about your life has not gone the way you thought it would and has brought you disappointment and grief? Know that you can take that disappointment and grief to God. You can express it to God. Hannah poured out her heart to God. And that's what we need to do when we face disappointment and when we face grief. We need to be willing and able to pour our heart out to God, even if we're a little angry about it. Now, Hannah wasn't angry here, but even if we're angry, we need to pour that out to God. God can take our anger. God is a big boy. He is not threatened by our anger. He understands it, and He responds in love and compassion. No, God doesn't always give us everything for which we ask. God doesn't always answer our prayers the way He answered Hannah's. But God does promise His presence with us. In times of difficulty, God does not let us face that time alone. If we will pour out our hearts to Him, God will respond with His presence. And I hope that's a word of encouragement for you. I hope you'll join us again as we continue this series. Also, join us for worship on Sunday mornings. This Sunday, the service will be available after 9 o'clock on YouTube, Facebook, and the church webpage. We're going to go back to in-person worship the first Sunday in March 7th. So come and join us then. If you can't, know that we will still record the services and make them available later on Sundays, even after we're back to worshiping in person. Let me conclude our study with a time of prayer. Bow with me, please. Heavenly Father, we thank you for your presence with us. We all go through times of difficulty, and only you know how difficult those times can be and how they can wound our hearts and the depths of grief that we sometimes experience. Whatever we are facing, oh God, be with us. Respond to our prayers. You may not give us exactly what we want, but we want to know that you are there and that you are listening. And so we ask that you give us the presence of your Spirit, that it might fill us, that it might encourage us, that it might help us deal with the disappointments and the griefs we face in this life. These things we pray in the name of Christ. Amen. Thank you.